other publications. And honestly, when you hear from people who have met him before, including Manish sir and maybe me too now, the first thing they will say is that beyond his scholarship, he is one of the kindest persons you will ever meet, and even the most generous one.
Right.
After our own interactions with the email, I am email and the ones we have had coming down to there. I think I really feel this very strongly that he's one of the most sweetest persons to talk to. So, with this much gratitude for your time and presence, sir, may I now invite my batchmates to present the welcome.
Yeah.
2-3 more people from the batch.
Thank you very much.
Aida.
Well, thank you very much. The first thing that I want to say is I think I'll get Vidya to come and describe me in similar kind of words to my wife. She might think about me differently. Especially the word sweetest, you know. Thank you very much. That's lovely. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's lovely. Okay.
Please feel free to take it.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. I will speak for about 45, 50 minutes, but some of the comments that I'm going to make are going to be really quite complicated to some of you, not all of you, but I do want you to say, feel free to put up your hand sort of saying, I don't understand. I'll try to make it as accessible and as straightforward as I possibly can, but it's not always possible to do that when you come from one country to another country, because the level of understanding and the concepts that are widely used in one context are not necessarily used in another context. And that's the problem with policy transfer. When you transfer policy from one country to another country, it's not only the words that you transfer, it's also the culture within which those words have meaning. You actually transfer emotions as much as anything else, you know. So when I read things coming out of the United States, so often I am able to sort of say, aha, this is coming from, because there is certain way of thinking about the world that is not necessarily the same in another place. So I'm very mindful of the fact that contexts matter, and we need to actually understand the context so that we can be clear about how are we going to do that. Can you actually could you sit down here, and when I say press next one, do that? You can be my Laurel and Hardy. Okay. Please sit down. And okay, all right. Okay. So the first thing that I want to. Hello. How are you? The first thing that I want to say is policy is defined in a number of different ways. Here are some of the perspectives on policy that I want to introduce to you. I'm assuming that there are some people who have not thought deeply about policy, and hence I need to provide something of the background. So those of you who know about policy a great deal, you'll probably find this really quite simple-minded, but there is a reason why I want to do this. A policy articulates the best possible means to realize a set of ends, values, goals, and objectives. And this quite often is referred to as the rationalist approach. It is, if you like, an approach that suggests that you have certain ends and that are defined by a group of people, and it's the means that define what a policy is. Another definition is a policy is a set of ideas or a plan of what to do in a particular context that has been agreed to officially by a group of people or an organization. This is sometimes referred to as the engineering view. It's like saying, we're going to build a bridge there, we're going to find out how to build the bridge. Our goal is equity, so equity is not policy. What you do to promote and actualize equity, that is the policy. So it's from the perspective of that definition, again, it's what you do in order to realize the goals in a particular context. Another way of looking at policy is it's a proposed course of action of an agency, organization, association within a given environment to overcome certain obstacles or realize certain possibility. This is a pragmatic view, that policy always presupposes that something needs to be worked about a condition about which we are not entirely comfortable. Okay, so as a result, we try to develop a kind of a plan, if you like, to to overcome certain obstacles. A policy represents a solution to a set of given problems confronted by agency. This is the problem-solving view. And a policy is designed to transform society in a more progressive, socially just, and democratic tradition. And this might be referred to as critical. The reason why I put those lists there is to really get you to think about how policy does not have a single definition. It has multiple definitions, and then there is a great deal of debate even about something like a policy. Okay, I mean, we use the word policy quite a bit, and we think that we all agree with its meaning. That is not the case. And the reason why I put these different perspectives is to demonstrate to you that there are different ways in which people think about policy, and there are different traditions. I myself locate myself and my scholarship in the last perspective, but I'll show how other perspectives are also relevant and important. Next one, please. Each of these definitions raise different kinds of questions. If you're simply focusing on means to a given end, then you ask different kind of questions. Then if you're focusing on criticality, and if you're focusing on progressive changes, then you focus on different kinds of questions. The third one, and here is an example in relation to a problem-solving view. The questions that you ask, if you subscribe to that perspective, problem-solving perspective from the previous page, then here are some of the questions that you'll ask. Which problem, and why do they need to address anyway? So basically you might say that we need to develop a policy in relation to caste, okay? Some people sort of saying, no, we don't need that policy, okay? So it's, if you like, people determine what needs to be studied, why and how, okay? It's not as simple as, here is a problem, we'll solve it. How is the problem framed? How is the problem characterized? How is the problem defined? Those things matter, okay? So who determines the need to address the policy in the first place? I have come across lots of examples where there are group of people who think this is an urgent problem that needs to be solved. But the bureaucrats sort of saying, no, it's too costly, it's not time, we'll do it some other time, or this is a policy, that this is an area that really is not all that important. So the question becomes, which problem do you want to solve? Which problem do you want to address? And that raises the issue of how policy problems are prioritized. Governments can't do everything. A school can't do everything. So basically those sort of things, we will focus on this policy rather than this. That means the issue of prioritization comes in. But issues of prioritization is not easy to resolve, not easy to understand, because deeply political issues are involved in understanding. We were talking earlier on with Vidya. The concept of knowledge economy has kind of declined. So the question, if Vidya was doing this particular idea from this perspective, is to ask the question, what were the problems that was prioritized and that was characterized and that needed to be solved in 2005, but they don't need to be addressed in 2025? What has changed? What are the historical circumstances that require us to frame and prioritize policy differently? What concepts are relevant for what purpose and in what context is the question. How are problems constructed or framed? How are they defined? Because you can have all kinds of problems and they'll be defined differently. So for example, if you want to explain something like, why does Mary fail in mathematics? You can provide a whole range of ways of framing that particular problem in terms of socioeconomic background, in terms of politics of schools, in terms of cultural politics, etc., etc. So in other words, what makes policy studies exciting is these questions are at one level difficult to resolve, but another level interesting and exciting to ask. Okay, so it's the asking of the questions which means you continue to have debate on this. What assumptions are made? Why did Mary fail? There is a concept of failure that we have assumed. How do we define failure? When we make an assertion and we've been trying to find out an explanation for why Mary fails. Okay, so you can see that assumptions are, there are interests involved, so different groups of people address problems differently. Okay, I mean, I can imagine in a political context, some issues are considered absolutely important by one group, but not by another group. What interests are served in framing problems, and how might the solution specified already frame the problem? In other words, sometimes when we ask a question about a problem or describe a problem, we already make certain assumptions that, like for example, why did Mary fail? In the notion of failure, if you believed in a form of education where nobody fails, then that question becomes mute. That question becomes stupid, if you like, if you actually think everyone should succeed. If you actually begin with the premise of ubiquitous success everywhere, then failure becomes a very toxic kind of concept. So, but that's from a particular perspective. From another perspective, of course, describing failure and explaining failure and then trying to resolve some kind of approach to address failure becomes really important. But underneath it all is the notion of failure, okay, which is not necessarily agreed to and interpreted and articulated and characterized by everybody in the same way. Now, each of these questions cannot be adequately answered without focusing, in my view, as to who does it and whose authority are we looking at, and the political culture that is inevitably spatially and temporally defined. In other words, the context in which these questions are asked and answered, or the questions that are not asked. As the authority structure change so do the approaches to policy development and analysis. There is a very popular definition, and this is actually the crunch of, what I've said so far is a bit of a background. Okay, most of you would have thought about those issues, but now I'm coming to the more. A very old but a good definition of policy, which I have used since 2005, and I have looked for better definitions, have not found them. So I have actually stuck to a definition that I first came across in 2002 and have been using in most of my writings as a way of trying to understand what problems it is giving rise to. And this definition is a very simple and straightforward definition. It was developed in the 1950s when I was a young lad, okay, by David Easton, who was a political scientist and a fairly significant political scientist. His definition of policy was, policy is authoritative allocation of values. Authoritative allocation of values. So policy is about something that ought to be done, some values that ought to be realized. The question that this definition raises is whose value? Which value? And how do we decide that these values are more important than these values? So policy always has embedded within it some assumptions about values which are often not articulated or specified with any degree of clarity. Okay? Which values? Whose values? And why is this value more important than other values? The other thing that is also important is whose authority? The government? The school? The teacher? The corporation? The market? Whose authority? Whose authority matters in deciding which policy and how? Okay, so the question of authority becomes really important. And then the idea of allocated is also important. How is the policy allocated, disseminated, distributed, and sort of promoted and given to the people so that they more or less accept the authority of that allocation? Allocation can be done a whole range of ways. One way of doing allocation is simply write a policy and put it on the what might be called government register. Okay. The other one that is maybe important is to go on television and promote it. Another way of doing it is to produce a glossy booklet that describes the policy. All of that stuff is done in order to promote and persuade people, those people who are subjected to. So educational policy is quite often designed to persuade as much as to enact. So when you look at NEP 2002, 2000, 2020, that's how you say it. See, I don't speak that language. 2020, that's the, 2020 is a lovely way of thinking. 2020 look, but that's very good. 2020, okay? It's possible to study how was not only how the policy was developed, but how it was allocated, how it was promoted, so that teachers, schools, and school systems and state authorities imbibe it and they take it and make it their own. Because policy is no good if it's only written on a piece of paper. Policy is only as good as the people who are responsible for enacting it believe in it. Okay, otherwise it's just a piece of paper, nothing more than that. So allocation becomes really important issue. So the definition, authoritative allocation of values. The reason why I like the definition is because it raises some of the fundamental questions that we need to ask in relation to any approach to policy analysis. Okay, because it raises the question of values, it raises the kind of question of allocation, and it raises the question of whose authority and how is that authority expressed and ensured. So what I want to do in this talk, I want to discuss the idea of authoritative, and hence it's in red, in policy processes. How policy becomes authoritative, okay? How has 2020 NEP become authoritative, okay? How has the government secured the authority so that there are not too many people who, let's say, this policy is no good, okay? Or they might say it, but nonetheless, they're expected to enact it. They're expected to implement it. So how do policies become authoritative? So that their legitimacy is often assumed by those who are expected to enact them. In other words, policy establish a relationship between design and implementation and consequences. And this is a complicated relationship that we need to think about. Okay. What tools and strategies are used to encourage compliance? Okay. What kind of punishment is there? Or is there any punishment if you don't follow NEP 2020? Okay. How strict is it? Okay. What are the mandates? Whose mandate? Those become really quite an interesting questions. How is authority thus allocated? By making policies authoritative, how is power exercised? And that raises the question of what is the nature of the relationship between authority and power, policy authority and exercise of power, how are those two things connected? So that's another thing. What happens when authority structures begin to change or even break down? And this is your question, yeah. You're basically sort of saying the authority structures relating to the discourse of knowledge economy has become eroded or have even become or are in the process of becoming broken down. So that there are not many people now in 2025 that are using the concept of knowledge economy like they did 20 years ago. Okay? So something has happened for the discourse itself to shift. And the question of why the discourse has shifted raises a whole range of questions, how policies get replaced once the authority that they once had is no longer applicable or no longer regarded as legitimate. What happens when these authority structures break down, yes, please. So, let me actually sort of very quickly give a lesson in social theory, which some of you would already know. So, but no, nonetheless, I think it's the idea of authority was discussed very profoundly by German sociologist Max Weber. Has perhaps provided the most widely cited, not the most influential, not the most powerful, but the most widely cited, widely cited analysis of the idea of authority in his book, Politics as Vocation. Weber defines authority as legitimate form of domination. Legitimate form, not illegitimate. Okay? The reason why Taliban don't have policies in the way that democratic governments have policies is because the power structure is different and legitimacy is accorded differently. Legitimate form of domination. So in liberal democratic countries, there is domination. And in very authoritarian countries, there is domination. But the domination is of different kind and different order. Okay? In a communist country like China, when a policy is issued, then there is a different reaction to the reaction that we find in a country like India or Australia or United States or whatever. That's one of the things that's really interesting in relation to Mr. Trump, because some people argue that the way in which he is exercising authority is radically different from the kind of traditions that Americans think that they have always valued. Okay? So in other words, his notion of authority is different to the notion of authority that traditions of American liberal democracy have promoted. So goes the argument. All of these arguments can be contested. So the Weber defines as a legitimate form of domination. That is, forms of domination which follows and subordinates those people who are subjected to that policy consider to be legitimate. So the notion of legitimacy becomes really important here. Policy has a certain kind of legitimacy. An instruction is very different to a policy. Policy involves compliance, a policy involves legitimacy, a policy involves a nature of a relationship between those in authority and those who implement whatever it is that is promoted by the policy. So the idea of legitimate, does not necessarily imply any sense of rationality, right or natural justice, Weber argues, but a contingent political relationship. Contingent political that relationship is historically specific. It can change, and hence it's contingent as opposed to necessary or absolute. Okay? Not necessary or absolute. It's a contingent relation that invites compliance without any necessary use of force or violence, though the threats of violence is always present in policy. In other words, force of some kind of punishment is always there. Okay. There are symbolic policies like gender equity that may not have any implications in relation to, but a policy about sexual harassment, for example, may have elements of force and sort of saying, if you don't follow, then the law is going to go after you. So gender equity is kind of like a symbolic policy, whereas sexual harassment is a material policy. It has material consequences. You know, if you break the policy, then, so there is an element of symbolism, but it's a bit more than that. Whereas NEP 2020, you could argue, is largely a symbolic policy. Okay? It is actually trying to create a culture of education in ways that is considered driven by certain kinds of values. The idea of authority invokes a sense of obligation and responsibility. Okay? You all feel that 2020 NEP invokes a sense of compliance, some sense of obligation. You should do it. Why should you do it? Why can't you ignore all its dictates or all its prescription? Because the nature of the political relationship between the state, which has come up with that policy, the department, and you, is defined by a form of, at one level, instruction or advice, suggestions, prescription, and the other level, on the other side, obligation, somehow an agreement, compliance, etc. So the relationship is what we need to focus on, and it's authoritative relationship that lies at the heart of all educational policy. Weber makes a distinction between authority and power. Power refers to the potential or ability of an individual or an institution to influence others and control their behavior. That's exercise of power. Through force if necessary. The idea of authority instead refers to legal and formal right to make a decision and give commands. In other words, the government feels that it can issue certain prescriptions, certain commands, without necessarily implying that if you don't do it, then you're in trouble. However, Weber recognizes that the relationship between power and authority is complex. Sometimes power is much more visible in the exercise of power, authority, and other times it's not. So I've just recently come back from China, and I've got to tell you that as you talk to people and their understanding of Chinese policies and education, then there is a sense of fear, literally, that I may be doing something that's wrong. In other words, the top-down relationship is a very strong one, and it's not only an obligation, it's not only a suggestion, it is almost like a sense of instruction. And as a result, in China, people often do not make a distinction between a policy and law. They don't make a distinction. So Chinese educational policy is often referred to as education law. We don't refer to our policies as law in Australia and in England and in this country. We actually make a distinction between law and policy. Policy has got a very different kind of sense of relationships of political kind. He recognizes the complex relation. Power is often used to legitimate decision, making them appear authoritative. Sometimes power is used in a very punitive kind of way, while the language of authority is used. So there is a difference between those things. Weber describes three kinds of authorities. Where do authorities come from? One of them is charismatic authority. Mahatma Gandhi had charismatic authority. Nelson Mandela had charismatic authority before he became the president. Because as soon as he became the president, he also acquired legal rational authority. And then there is another kind of authority, which is traditional authority. Pope has traditional authority. It's by traditions. Pope can be as boring as you like, but he carries with him, the traditions of 700 years of papacy. And as a result, he's able to articulate things and people would take that seriously. So in that sense, Pope's authority is maybe both a charismatic, it could be traditional, and it could be legal rational. Prime Minister can have, and some people will argue Mr. Modi does, he has a lot of charisma, and he, as a result, people follow him, not because he's Prime Minister, but because he's Modi, he has that kind of personality, Barack Obama had that kind of charismatic authority, but there are other people who have authority that is simply legal rational, following legally and rationally created rules. In contemporary society, these types have arguably become fused. They become kind of mixed, creating a complex authoritative architecture in which reasons and emotions have become intertwined in policy processes. So policy is not only about reason, but it's also about how people feel, okay, and how people react to particular. So as a result, huge amount of work is done in lots of countries for ministers to go out and be interviewed on television, in order to persuade people that the policy is a good policy. Okay, so, and that is done as a way of allocating the policy. Remember the definition? Allocating the policy. So, so these policies have become fused. The ways in which policies become authoritative depends on the form of political system. So in China, the authority is exercised in ways that are very different. In Afghanistan, authority is exercised in ways that is very different. It's traditional, and sometimes it's charismatic, okay? And sometimes it's... So Taliban's authority in Afghanistan is born out of Islamic traditions, and it is born out of the fact that it is in government. But it may not have any charismatic authority at all, okay? So as a result, authority works differently. In most systems, policy is assumed to be different from law, administrative dictate, or moral and cultural value, but not in all systems. In China, for example, politics is organized and power and authority are exercised differently, ensuring a closer relationship between law and policy. Sometimes they're identical. There's no difference, okay? So different political systems have different ways of looking at policy, interpreting policy, and enacting policy, and allocating policy. Okay. Even within liberal democracies, different political systems exist, such as a federalist system and a centralized system. India's system of politics is a federal system. Australia is a federal system. Okay. Those states' policies are allocated and policy are made authoritative very differently to the ways in which policies are made authoritative in a state which is a single state government, okay, single state. For example, Bangladesh, okay, there are regions, but there is not formal system of 26 states, in Australia's case, 6 states. And education is quite often a state matter in most federal states. But in recent years, federal governments across all the federal countries have become more and more centralized. More and more central government has assumed the power which in constitution is to be left to the states. So UP has its own educational policy. But the power of NEP to 2020 is now a central imposition on the federal structures, okay? And as a result, authority has become both centralized and at another level devolved down to local government and local schools. So one of the things that we've witnessed in many, many different countries is both a move towards centralization and move towards decentralization. At the same time, bypassing the middle tier. What is the middle tier? The state government. Okay? The state government gets steps aside. So in Australia, the funding for education comes largely from the central government. Okay? And the power of the purse is very important. It allows them to become authoritative in the legal rational sense and bypass the states, because they can always withdraw the money from the state, so the states can't do what they want to do. So as a result, what we're having is a kind of isomorphism, convergence of policies towards the federal state. Even within, the authoritative stuff, issues of power, politics, and authority are thus centrally linked to policy process and define the ways in which policies steer, guide action, and prescribe how its mandates are and should be understood, monitored, and enforced. Can we have the next one? Policies serve many different purposes. And this is important to note. before we go to the approaches to policy analysis. Policies serve many, sometimes symbolic and sometimes material. Symbolic policies are those policies that are supposed to create a kind of a cultural climate in which you believe those things. So a lot of people criticize gender equity policies because they say it's too symbolic, there's nothing hangs on it. If you don't do it, then there is no penalty, there is no mandate. It should be made much more material. In other words, if somebody doesn't actually pursue a gender equity policy, then there should be some kind of consequences. Multiculturalism could be regarded as a symbolic policy. And yet, something like finance policy, finance of higher education policies, are material policies. So can you see the difference between the material? Variously, they guide action. Okay, they're supposed to guide your behavior, policies. They are supposed to distribute or redistribute resources, like a taxation policy, for example. They legitimize existing or new practices. Sometimes policies develop after something has become totally institutionalized already. Okay, so as a result, people have been doing the same thing, but somehow governments feel that they need to codify a practice that already exists. Okay, so as a result, policies are a legitimizing instrument. Policies can be enforced through various mandates. Policies serve symbolic and educative purposes. Many years ago, about 30 years ago, I was part of a group that developed Australia's multicultural education policy. Okay, it's something that I really quite enjoyed doing, and basically we started putting mandates on. An instruction from the government came to this group that was developing multicultural education, is that you are making it too material. It's going to actually open us up for all kinds of legal challenges, all kinds of requirements of money. We don't have the money to spend on this policy. We want you to tone it down. Why tone it down? So that it becomes what, culture. So basically, the idea was to promote feelings of multiculturalism rather than have multiculturalism do something actual. Okay, the idea was to create a kind of values climate. Okay, in which we felt that multicultural society was a good society. So in other words, we were promoting something that, if you like, religious doctrines do. So policy was serving a purpose of basically creating a moral climate. Okay, and that's actually what we were left with. In fact, there are some of the people in the group, including myself, felt that we should resign because from this particular group that was given responsibility to develop the policy, was because nothing mattered very much except for creating a particular climate, until we were persuaded that sometimes creating a climate is a very important thing to do. To respect, for example, villages and a city space, when they are not respected, and you develop a policy to create a climate in which people are treated respectfully. So those kind of things. The other thing that policies do is they build consent around within a community or an organization. The reason why schools develop policies is because they want to create a way of a cohesive way of thinking about our purposes, our values, and so on. So building consent is also a purpose of policy. So policies have lots and lots of different purposes. Now, some of these purposes can be realized without complex systems of persuasion, coaxing or inducement, guiding and steering. That is, ensuring that policies are widely regarded as authoritative. All the work of coaxing is done largely as a way of getting people to agree with it without having to rely on mandates and punishments. Okay? In other words, policies are designed to ensure that you buy into our values narrative. Okay? Values narrative becomes really quite important. And that's one of the functions of policy that is really very important. With respect to educational policies, traditionally, the authority of policies was based on religion and church and so on, professional guilds, and dictates of rulers. Now, so in other words, authority was a traditional and charismatically defined or induced. Now it is increasingly the case that we sorry? Okay. Sorry? Zoom? Okay. Sorry, there are too many words. That's not a very good practice, by the way. If you're producing PowerPoint, don't do it. Have fewer words. But once you start writing these things, you get carried away and you don't break it up. I should have broken it. So basically, what I'm saying is that authority was traditional. Now it is more and more legal rational. So the bureaucratization of policy processes has meant that we do not rely on traditions and on charisma to the extent that we did some time ago, okay, many decades ago. The Industrial Revolution brought the state to the forefront in the development of educational policy, and the state has become now the dominant actor. Urbanization, secularization, colonialism, all of these things really were about management of populations. So one of the things that policies does, and here is something that I would like you to note, they're designed to manage populations. Manage populations, okay? So when educational policy it is designed to manage educational processes. It is designed to manage teachers' behavior. It is designed to manage student subjectivities. So one of the things that the state now is increasingly interested in is to develop certain kinds of citizens, certain kinds of subjects. Okay. Colonialism started the process, but independent governments do the same thing as the colonial powers did. Okay, they try to create a certain kind of citizen, certain kind of a national subject. The role of the state in educational policy processes, however, was never uniform and static and has grown but also changed since the beginning. In recent decades, the state agencies have had to work hard to ensure that policies are treated as authoritative. In other words, instruction dictates, edicts don't cut it. You have to think about complex ways in which through policies you guide people, okay? You get them to consent to the norms that policies, and that has become a major work of policy. To build consent, the state employs a wide variety of mechanisms of persuasion, and these mechanisms are becoming more and more complex. Let me give you an example from mine. In year 2000, in a policy development unit in Australia, in the state of Victoria where I live, okay, one of the states, we had 7 policy developers, including a lawyer, okay, and 1 person to promote the policy. In 2020, the number of people who did the technical work of developing policies went down to 3, and the number of people who promoted the policy went up to 15. What does that tell you? That the requirement of persuasion was. The other thing that happened is in 2000, the policy came on rolled or photocopy. Now, when policies are allocated, delivered, then big hoopla has happened. There's a huge launch. Lots of people are invited. Lots of people give nice speeches so that they can be captured on television. The other thing that happens is that the policy is produced in glossy brochures. Okay? You have a look at the policies when they were launched in 1990s, and you have a look at the policies that are not launched now. Okay? the quality of the language, persuasive language, the quality of the ways, the picture of relevant figures, Minister of Education, Prime Minister, etc., is all, the colorful brochure, okay, all those sort of things. What does that tell us about policy and policy processes? What does that tell us? The very ways in which policies are developed and allocated now has changed greatly. The term that we use is the policy processes have become increasingly mediatized. The role of media has become incredibly important in making sure, sorry, can we go there? Next one? Next one? Okay. Mechanism. Mediatization of policy process. This has become a study in its own right. When policies are allocated, what media, what information systems, what ways of allocating, persuading people, building consent now happens. So as a result, designers and media experts are now employed in policy units in the various departments of education. Okay. Now these people are there largely as a way of making sure that the policies are persuadable. Okay. The whole thing about persuasion becomes, so the success of policy quite often depends on the extent to which those people who are supposed to carry out that policy believe in it. How do you ensure that they own it as if the policy is their own? Okay, that becomes a really important part of the processes of policy development and allocation. Okay, this is not policy evaluation. This is not policy design. This is just simply the ways in which policies are rolled out. Okay, how they're rolled out is now as important as what the content of the policy is. The content of policy may actually be brilliant, but if nobody believes in it or nobody knows about it, then it's considered to be redundant. Can you see? So mediatization of policy processes refers to the use of emerging information systems and new communication technologies and social media to allocate, remember the word, allocate policy, not only to disseminate the information, but also to build consent. Okay. WhatsApp groups are an important instrument in policy processes. They were never an important process, even when they first came out. But now people think policies have to be on LinkedIn, they have to be in Twitter, they have to be, and we have to tell lots and lots of stories about how good the policy is. Authoritative figures, charismatic figures, are brought into the service of supporting a policy so that consent is at least encouraged, if not ensured. Okay, so policy processes are becoming really very important. And that means that every so often we need a new vocabulary, because people think old vocabulary is exhausted. Knowledge economy is old world. It doesn't suit the requirements of 2025. Okay, it is something that you need to think about in relation to. So there's something that has changed. If you're going to capture something new, then you have to invent new words, new ideas, new ways of thinking about things. Okay, and as a result, the discourse changes as the text changes. So policy analysis is quite often a way of analyzing not necessarily the text, but discourse. What's the difference between text and discourse? Texts are the words that are written down, whatever they are. Discourse is the broader space, broader discursive space in which those words have meaning and have significance and become consequential. Can you see what I'm trying to say? Okay. And that is important way to study policy, to sort of say, how is consent being built? So you don't only look at the text. Text is important, don't get me wrong, because text actually tells you what the policy is of what its content is, what are the values that are being. But allocation and authority are as important as the text. Okay? Securing buy-in, forms of commitment to the policy priorities. So it could be argued that if the NEP 2020 was launched and then forgotten about, then policy was not very effective, even though it had some very good ideas. It could have great ideas, okay? But if it's not disseminated, if it's not allocated, around which attempts are not made to build consent, then it's empty, okay? It doesn't have the significance. It's not consequential. It hasn't produced any kind of decent outcome.
What
So
does buy-in mean?
or buying in, I buy in, which is a phrase that used, which means we own it. It becomes ours. I buy it, you know. So basically, this water is yours until I take it. It's a buy-in. Okay. The same applies to policy ideas. We are buying it in. It's a very, very commodified language. Okay, that is true. But nevertheless, it's a phrase that is used quite a lot in policy literature. How do you ensure policy buy-in? Okay, okay. Is that not phrase here, not used here? Okay, all right. The other thing that is done nowadays to buy in and to build consent is the use of comparative data, datafication, if you like. To secure the authority of policies in education, comparative examples have long been used to inspire confidence in policies. You know, this is a good policy because Japan is doing it as well. This is a good policy because Americans have been experimenting with this policy. Okay? In other words, comparison is used not simply to make a judgment about policy, but use it rhetorically. Okay? So inspire confidence in policies. Okay? Learning from others, but is now done more systematically through your use of the emerging technologies of comparison, using data to persuade, cajole, and steer opinion. PISA, which you all have heard about, it does comparison, but it does much more than that. Much, much more. It puts pressure on systems to change policies towards that direction, towards the content upon which PISA exam is built, PISA testing is based. Okay, so that is actually what PISA comparative data is done. All the other data that we produce is done. So for example, we sort of saying, Korea invest 11% in higher education. We in Australia only invest 6%. Implication? We should be putting in more money in education. You see what I mean? So in other words, comparative data is designed to steer governments towards certain policies. And the governments use comparative data to put, if you like, fear into the communities. So when PISA's result first came out, Germany was way down in the ranking. The initially German government and German educational authority were absolutely panicked. How is it that an advanced country like us is performed so badly that it's coming 20th out of 25? But then the government says, we know, we can use this PISA panic to drive reforms of particular kind. Can you see what I'm saying? So policy is doing a huge number of things than simply presenting what ought to be done. With the emergence of global markets in education, various ranking systems is to ensure effectiveness and prestige. Comparative data is now widely circulated within national system to convince a cynical teaching profession of merits of particular policy proposal. Teachers are always cynical. Educationists are always cynical. because we've seen it all kinds of things have been tried and they haven't always worked. So the policy's job now is to persuade a relatively cynical profession, okay, that what is being proposed is a good proposal. Okay, so that's actually what it is. So datification or data is now being used for all kinds of political purposes, to build authority of particular proposals and to build consent, to get buy-in and so on. And seductive power of datafication is now promoted. Because we've got so much data, we talk about evidence-based policy development, okay? Because data, there's an assumption that because we have collected so much data, then our proposals would somehow be better, okay? So with growing capacity to produce limitless amount of demographic and performance information, data has become a major ingredient in establishing the merits of policy proposals, as well as the authority of policy priorities, often sidelining moral and cultural conditions. Without reference to a wide-ranging data, authority of policy is quite often denied. So you put forward a brilliant idea, and people sort of saying, we can't take it seriously because it's not backed up by data. Okay, so we actually see data as having a seductive power, which is the frame. It has become something that is, the content of data is less relevant than the use of data in the political terms. Recent developments in artificial intelligence are likely to lead to changes the ways in which policies are developed and implemented and evaluated and revised. So artificial intelligence is likely to generate new strategies of persuasion, new strategies of getting buy-in, new strategies new strategies of consensus building. What do we have for the next one? Thank you. Next one. Oh. And this, of course, has led to research on focus on research and evidence policy. And all this is returning to a form of empiricism that existed that we kind of moved away from. But now these developments are being derived from supposed facts. So it's not values that are driving fact, it's the facts that are supposed to be driving. But that relationship is deeply troublesome, as does the question of how normative ideological positions determine the selection of the data that counts as evident. And so there are a whole range of issues that are emerging. I think I'll finish off very soon. Okay, that are emerging, okay, that are making it very difficult for us to see policy only in terms of the best means to a given end. Because means are all very well, but the end are important to not only define clearly, but also to convert them and frame them in such a way that they are persuasive. The persuasion is an important part of policy process. Can I have the next one? I'll go quickly. And of course, we are seeing triumph for technocracy in policy processes. I think I'll go to the next one, please. And the engineering model.
This one?
Yeah, yeah. So basically, what I'm saying is that there are different approaches to policy analysis. Let me just finish very, very quickly by saying there are three ways of doing it. One way of thinking about policy processes is to actually study policy and study evidence to build a case for a normative position. Okay? In other words, bureaucrats, the kind of work that they do in policy processes is to build and rely upon data. And out of that, they build a case, and then that case is popularized and persuadable. So basically, that's one approach. The other approach to policy is really simply to look at and trying to figure out what meaning and what sense do communities make of the policies once they are allocated. How is the allocation is successful or not? And how is the authority being exercised? And what do people feel about that? So that's kind of like an anthropological approach. So you might say there is a system functionalist approach that is about developing policies. The other approach to policy is to understand what meaning people allocate to it and what significance that they see. So in other words, instead of studying policy at the level of production, you study the policy at the level of practice. And the third level is to actually go critical and try to understand what assumptions are being made, what kind of ideas are embedded within that policy, and so on. These three approaches, the technical approach, the technocratic approach, the anthropological approach, and the critical approach, are very different. But they interpret the ideas of allocation and interpret the practices of allocation and the nature and scope of authority and how it's exercised differently. So if you're thinking about doing some research in policy studies, think about what traditions exist in policy. Technocratic tradition, the anthropological tradition, and the critical tradition. But ask yourself the question, how is authority interpreted in relation to each of those traditions? Okay, I think I'll finish off there, if you don't mind. Okay.
I think there's a lot going on in our, there's a lot of questions popping up. I would like to invite our senior research scholar, Abhishek, to kind of take a few questions and wind up the discussion.
Sorry, there's a question down there. So, is Abhishek?
I suppose we'll have the vote of thanks first.
Right.
No, we will have a question.
I'll just moderate the Q&A session.
Yes.
Wonderful.
So we have questions. Yeah.
Hello, sir. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I'm Arushi. I'm in my first year of PhD doing my coursework from JNU. I think I'm still stuck in the first few slides that you presented. And when you wrote authoritative allocation of values is something that you spoke in detail about. And my question emerges from that, more of a thought, less than a question. For instance, when we talk about policy making in general, and in this session particularly, we're talking about education policy making.
Sure.
I feel that we come from a position of power in defining what is education and what is not education.
Sure. Yeah.
So coming from that context, why at this day and age we still focusing so much, and or to rephrase it and to phrase it properly, I would say why our sole focus right now is also on more institutionalized ways of knowledge procurement, if I can call it. What about the non-institutional forms of knowledge, and how, as for instance, if I take like a critical stance at education policy making, and as a young researcher myself,
Yeah.
how can I look at education
In a
in
broader,
suppose a specific community, like an artisan community, wherein there is intergenerational passing of knowledge happening through art forms. So how do we look at that, and how do we develop like a more critical lens to understanding policy through non-institutionalized forms of knowledge?
absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Now, that's a very, very important question. Policy is only developed for people, for institutions that can be controlled. Okay? It is very difficult to develop policies for the organic life of communities. Okay? Very, very difficult, because they are so diverse and so complex that governments don't want to touch it. Okay? That's one thing. The other thing that you say, I agree with it absolutely. Most schools of education that I have come across around the world, school meaning faculties of education, okay, college of education, invariably focus on institutional forms of education and do not focus enough on other sites of education where potentially education is as influential and as consequential as in the schools. So I was having, I came back from Mahindra University in Hyderabad this morning, okay? And one of the conversations we were having was, why is it that Mahindra, which has an opportunity to create its own distinctive kind of school of education, because it's got money and it's got people and they want to do something new. Why would you want to do the same kind of teacher education, school education, as just about everybody else is doing? I said to them that if you look at the sectors where education is taking place, not only informal spaces that you're talking about, but in between spaces. Let me give you some examples. Corporate training is a site of education in industry. Home shadow education is a site of education. In fact, a very rapidly growing site of education. Okay, and but yet we do very little to train those people who provide education in those tutorial colleges. Those people quite often reproduce some of the worst aspect of school education and school pedagogy. And yet we have an opportunity to actually think about those other sites of education that are becoming quite influential, which can affect school education in a whole range of interesting ways. So education takes place in the mandirs, in the masjids. Education takes place in the communities. Education takes place in a whole range of places. And yet, when we talk about policy, we only focus on that very, very small side of the spectrum. I think it's time for us to actually start thinking about how education takes place in a whole range of different places, in a whole range of different ways, especially with the emergence of computers and modes of communication in which there is a huge amount of information and ideas and all those sort of things stored. So I agree with you absolutely that I think policy focuses on too narrow a band of educational sites, too narrow, and as a result, it actually assumes a very traditional and very kind of restricted view of education. And education is much more than simply what goes on in schools. And yet, no government would develop a policy of community education. They might develop a statement about community education, and it's important, but not the kind of policy that could actually generate the whole sector into doing something interesting. The other thing is in relation to control. See, there are sites that can't be controlled. Governments, when they develop policy, they're not very keen on developing policies for the sites that they can't control. In other words, the process of allocation to community is much more difficult than process of allocation in formalized school systems. Does that make sense?
Okay. We have a question here at the back.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the really insightful lecture, sir. I'm Manan, and I'm someone who's interested in education policy. I just have a very quick follow-up question, actually. So when the NEP comes up and has...
Could you speak a little more slowly?
Sure,
because,
sure.
I'm not used to Indian accents, sorry.
Definitely. So when the NEP puts up or envisions or sets targets for itself like 100% enrollment at school level or 50% enrollment at higher education level by 2035, do you think that also impacts or that creates like a symbolic culture of understanding education only from an institutionalized lens and not giving or having the mindset or the scope of thought to look at education in the broader sense as you just mentioned?
Absolutely. The targets are set, but the targets, when they are set, they're set against a particular understanding of what would be the realization of the target. In other words, there is a values definition that is built into the targets. Targets are not only quantitative, they have a qualitative attribute. So when you sort of say that 50% will go to schools, well, that can be measured. But what cannot be done is go to school and succeed in what way? You see what I mean? So as a result, it becomes incredibly difficult to understand policy from the government's point of view that has all kinds of complexities in relation to the definition of education. And the target is, to my mind, targets are always conservative. Always conservative. They actually are calculating and predicting a way of realizing those targets that is already defined. You see what I mean? That is already defined. You know, okay? And where is the definition come from? From the past practice rather than future practice.
We have a question here.
Yeah. Very good. First and foremost, thanks, Professor Rizvi, for this very illuminating lecture. I have one small comment and three small questions to ask.
Three.
Yeah, which are very much related to each other.
Okay.
I won't elaborate on much. Comment is basically that when we try to look at the definition of policy in the context of David Eastonian definition which you referred, are we really able to encapsulate or capture the grounded reality related to the political economy which is being used in context of that authoritative allocation of value, especially in context of whose values these are?
Yes.
And two relative question is you referred quite eloquently that distinction that either there is over centralization, decentralization,
Yeah.
and state agency is being undermined.
Sure.
And here I just want to know from your good self that what seems to be the logic of undermining the state agency to your understanding. And third is most compelling question, which certainly most agitated me during your whole talk, that you constantly refer the term persuasion for the promotion. But don't you think that there is a very thin line between imposition and persuasion? And in real sense, it is in most of the cases imposition, not a persuasion, wherein no counter argument or valid comment is being entertained at all while doing that promotion. Forget the accommodation of that. Yeah, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Those are very eloquent questions, if I may say so, sir. You know, they're very, very important questions. Imposition and persuasion, the distinction between them. In my view, governments intend imposition, but they cannot actually believe that imposition will be successful unless there is persuasion. So persuasion is a means towards imposition. And this kind of corresponds with the distinction of Weber between authority and power. We pretend we are working with authoritative structures when in fact we are working with power structures. So the distinction between authority and power, according to Weber, is not as clear cut as it might appear. And I think the distinction between persuasion and imposition kind of captures that subtlety of that distinction in my view. Okay. The other thing that I want to say in relation to the state, to my mind, one of the things that really I find somewhat uncomfortable in the policy arena around the world, not only in this country, but everywhere that I visit and everywhere, there is an assumption that uniformity of policy across the whole nation, or perhaps even globally, is a good thing. Okay? And as a result, PISA is an expression of that. PISA is testing people against a certain view of education, certain way of thinking about education. And because we have bought into PISA to the extent that we are embracing the uniform view, the universal view of education. And I think the reason why states are important and states should be allowed is to promote diversity of types of education that are possible. The states can also be really quite horrible, and they can do all kinds of silly things, but at least if you have a number of states which are encouraged to develop education in relation to their own understanding of their locality, then we have a better chance of generating diversity rather than homogeneity. I actually am very critical of isomorphism of policy, okay, when policies are converging towards same direction. That's not necessary. That undermines cultural diversity, that undermines local authentic voices, that undermines a whole range of other things that we value in our local communities. So the answer to why I think states are important is because states are a way of ensuring diversity rather than uniformity.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for this very thought-provoking session. I am Vinita Arora, and I'm working with Ministry on implementation of policy. So my
There we go.
question is coming from ground.
Yeah.
We have been talking about in this session using terms like allocation and dissemination of policy.
Yeah.
But my question is that policies, the way they are created, are actually dichotomized from the ground.
Yeah.
The voices of the people whom it intend to affect are not really represented there. So how are we going to talk about or understand the terms like understanding the policy, interpreting the policy by the people for whom it is meant? And would that not follow the same process of dissemination, or would there be other processes if we are looking at really critically understanding the policy by the beneficiaries? So how would it look different than what it is at the moment? I mean, if I've put my question.
I think so. It's a very, very complex question, of course. I mean, there are 3 or 4 ways in which I can approach it, an answer to that. One is quite often policies are articulated because the policy makers, ministries, if you like, already recognize that there is something happening that they can codify. Okay? In other words, there is already, if you like, allocation has preceded the development and attempt at further allocation. In other words, you could argue that policy processes are largely about consolidation of preferred practices as opposed to any practices. You see what I mean? And that would be consistent with what you're saying, that I think there is but at the same time, allocation is important because people have diversity of views about what practices matter. And it's the streamlining of those practices that I think quite often policies attempt to do. So in other words, they would like a degree of honesty in relation to implementation processes. And as a result, people would say RTE was a wonderful policy, but it was badly implemented. Okay, you heard that said, haven't you? Now, so that means the policy was a failure, despite the fact that many of the ideas of RTE were not entirely new. They go back to the World Bank report of 1991 and all those. This is secondary literature that I'm talking about. I haven't done research in this. But, those are the kind of things that were already happening. So there is a complex relationship with grounded realities and things that are circulating. Now, the question becomes, why are certain things circulating in the ways that they are? And that requires us to understand that information about what is practiced in education does not only come from policy, it comes from a whole range of other directions as well. Some global, diasporic communities, etc., etc. Things are coming in from all kinds of. So what policy is trying to do is sort of saying, things are moving in every old directions. Is there any way that we can bring it together so that it appears that the policy is relatively harmonious? In EU, they use the word, I don't know whether they use that word here or not, harmonization. What is, have you heard that word? No. Basically what EU is trying to do is harmonize policies, public policies, across its 26 members, so that education looks more or less the same. The structure of degrees, structure of movement from one stage to another stage look more or less the same. The reason for that is that they say that will promote mobility and students to do 2 years of a degree here and 1 year degree in Portugal or something like that. So they said that can only happen, mobility can only happen when and if there is harmonization of policy. Harmony is a musical term, as you know. That means we are singing from the same song sheet. So policy that EU is, EU has no right to develop educational policies because policies are developed by nations. But it presents its policies in the language of harmonization. It is looking at policies from every old country and putting them together so that they sing together. Okay, so that there is a choir that has been established, and that's what harmonization of policy is. And I think there is quite a lot of harmonization that happens in policy. My view is that RTE was a harmonization of some of the practices that were already being tried. Okay, and sorry.
Is harmonization of better vocabulary to use for homogenization?
Absolutely, you are very, very clear. Very clear. Harmonize it. See, this is with the persuasive power. Persuasive power. Of if you said homogenization, people will be up in arms. Okay. If you use a softly spoken word, low toned down word, so instead of singing on top of your voice, you sing softly, softly. And that's what harmonization is. Harmonization is softly, softly.
Killing you softly.
Softly? They are killing you softly, but they're killing nonetheless.
Commonly used a similar term is standardization, especially in assessments.
Standardization is not a very, very popular word as well. A lot of people complain about standardization because that has that suggests compulsion. Okay, so what people want to sort of say, we are controlling the discourse, we are controlling the institutions, we are controlling the processes, imposition, if you like, but we are doing it through persuasive means. We're doing it democratically. We're killing softly. Does it make sense?
Thank you.
Hello, sir. It was really insightful.
I'm sorry I wasn't able to do more because there are 8 more pages there, but I'll leave the
Yeah, we can circulate
the PowerPoint and have a look at it.
So, my question is fairly simple. It is
No
not-
question is simple.
Oh, okay.
Not in this field.
Right, that's true. This is coming from a very personal standpoint because I'm beginning with my dissertation and it's mainly about policy versus practice gap.
Yeah.
So that's a dominant narrative we find in any policy in Indian framework at least. So is it necessary for young scholars or researchers to interrogate the assumption that Indian policy frameworks have not achieved what they have defined as an objective of their policy, um, more from a critical point of view, as you have
Sure.
said. But then again, the anthropological view comes in there when you're analyzing the policy.
How it's interpreted.
Yeah, because we're understanding the meaning of it. So is it necessary or should it be more, I don't know, should it be more from a point of view that we are just going to analyze the policy, but we are not focusing on the authority, as you've said. We're not discussing it as a dominant or anchor of defining policy.
Yeah, okay. Good question and good project. Okay, so I think when you think about policy in practice, the ideal assumption of a policy maker, policy demand, policy designer is that it's going to be implemented faithfully as articulated by the policy. That's an assumption, perhaps not assumption, but a hope. Realizing perfectly well that there is going to be a huge amount of deviation. And the deviation will happen largely because individuals, teachers, principals, are not only subject to policy as dictated, as edict, but also a whole range of other sources of knowledge. And what they are doing in practice is reconciling and embedding the policy in their existing practices and other practices that might suggest themselves, and practices that some other people might recommend to them, not necessarily the state. So in other words, implementation is always a very difficult concept. My colleague and friend, whose work some of you would know, Stephen Ball.
Yes, we know that.
Whose work, he's a lovely man. He's retired, unfortunately, and he's decided to write novels rather than write about policy. Maybe there's not all that much difference between writing a novel and... he says that if there is one word in policy studies vocabulary that he would abandon and kill, and that's word implementation. Implementation always suggests linearity. It always suggests a form of rationality that human beings are quite often not capable of. So his philosophical position is that policy is only one of many ingredients that articulate with each other that produce practice. And the assumption that A will generate B is fundamentally flawed, because A to B, there are a whole range of other things that intervene. So I ask Stephen Ball, what is the phrase that you better and rather use? And the concept that he is now, or in his last writings that he's using, is enactment rather than implementation, which gives the person who is doing the practice agency. They're not mechanical beings who are implementing faithfully policy in ways that is linear. They're enacting it to the extent and in the ways they understand the edict and reconcile it and assemble it with other things. One of my students, Radhika Guru,
Yes.
has
We know.
she was my, I have lots of PhD students actually. Sorry? 62, that's right. You were listening, weren't you? 60, yeah. Well, she uses the term policy as assemblage.
Yes.
Okay? That idea emerged as a result of the kind of supervisory conversations that we had. Policy is assembling a whole range of ideas, sometimes consistently and sometimes not. Sometimes loosely, but sometimes that resembles the faithfulness that policy designer is expecting. So the debate really is, how do we move from implementation as a logic to a logic of enactment and logic of assemblage? So that has become a live issue in policy studies. People are sort of fighting over it. There are some people who are still want to maintain the idea of implementation, but the other people have given up on it. They think that it has too much baggage of engineering model of policy making, the rationalist model. That's how I started off with all those models, the rationalist model, rather than problem solving or interpretive model or whatever other models. So can you see what I'm trying to say? So I think Radhika says that unless we understand how agencies intersect with each other and talk to each other to produce practice, we haven't got it. And one of the agents that is doing the intersecting with the people who are teachers and principals, one of the agencies, she argues,